Welcome to a run through of how to do cloisonne, which is just enameling with using small wires to divide your areas of color and give you tighter definition on your design. I have a piece of copper here. Copper is the metal I would recommend for you. It works the best, whereas I would not use nickel at all. It tends to have an issue with cooling down after the kiln and popping your wire off. Brass works pretty much the same as copper if you would prefer that. My copper piece has been cleaned and sanded. I just sanded it with a 400 grit or 600 grit sandpaper. It's not so much about getting it smooth since it's pretty flat already, but more so to clean any grime or oil off before I put my base coat on. My base color is the transparent. We have two of these jars. One is white, and I would recommend the transparent. The label will tell you which is which. This is just going to be on the base of my metal for my wire to stick into when it melts, and then I can work on top of it with other colors. When I am working with my enamel, I'm going to have a drop cloth, so I'm just going to use my hand out here, and then I have my enamel tray. This one has some melted glass on it, and if that is an issue for you, it may stick to the back of your metal piece and be something you have to file off. You can avoid it by putting your tray in the kiln for around 5 minutes just to melt off the enamel on purpose. So when I'm working on here, I'm just going to put my piece on a clean corner of the tray, and I've got my drop cloth. I can always use a lid if I'm working with a jar like this too. And then I sift a layer of my enamel on, and at this point you should be wearing a mask because remember that enamel powder is really bad to breathe in. You want to pack down your enamels, and you can use your finger, but I find that having a piece of paper helps so it doesn't stick to me. And then I'm going to fire this in the kiln for 1.5 minutes. On your step sheet here, there is a reminder that it should be at 1.5 minutes at 1450 degrees, and you should double check that if you forget, because a lot of times double check the screen of the kiln, because when we're all loading it together, it can drop in temperature and your piece might take a little bit longer, or you may need to wait for the kiln to heat up. So I will set my timer, and then we can start chatting about kiln safety while we are waiting on it. On this section of your handout that you have, it is all talking about safety for kiln firing and a couple reminders of when you fire. Make sure, most importantly, that you always have your hair pulled back and your sleeves pushed up when you are handling the kiln. Anything that touches near this kiln that is going to be flammable will be able to be set on fire, so be so careful when you are working with it. And then remember, like I said earlier, to always wear a mask when you are sifting your enamels or if you are sanding them. You just don't want to breathe in the dust. And then reminder, when you are firing things, it should be at 1450 and it should be for 1.5 minutes. I just had my timer go off, so when you have your pieces come out, with the cloisonne being a component of this, some of the enamels do okay if they slow cool, or some if they are quenched. When you quench it, you put your piece in water to cool it off faster. This also will knock off any fire scale, that oxidation that you get, but sometimes it will shock your enamel and you may have it crack off and pop your wire. I'm letting my slow cool while I'm cleaning this up right now, and then after maybe about 30 seconds or so, I'll quench it. That's kind of a good compromise when I want to be extra careful with mine. So I have my piece out of the kiln now. I quenched it after about 30 seconds and I'm drying it off. Every time you do a clear, it creates kind of a rosy color, but ultimately that will be covered up as we continue in the enameling process with whatever colors we put on top. At this point, typically you would put your wires on and melt them into place for your cloisonne, but to avoid warping, I want to talk a little bit about how you can potentially use counter enameling on the back of your piece. You can see that mine right now looks pretty grimy from the firing process. If I were to enamel this, I would need to clean that off before, and then ultimately, when I enamel this, I would use the trivet that's in my hand so I can set my piece on there and not get the grid marks. Before enameling, I still want to sand, so I would sand with my piece face down on a paper towel like I had. I would put it on this trivet. I usually would still use it on a tray to avoid loading this by hand. And then I would sift my enamel on. Then I would flip it over to keep working on in the future. And the reason that you counter enamel is so you don't have to clean up the back of your piece, and then also so you won't have any warping. Usually warping isn't the end of the world, but when you're working with cloisonne, it can potentially cause your wire to pop off. So I go over in the directions how to do counter enameling if you'd like to avoid that warping as an issue. So I have my wires here. I already sculpted some, but when I was making these, I want to walk through which pliers I would recommend. I like the full plier kits like this, and then I use a thinner gauge wire. The thinner your wire, the faster this process will go because you're building your enamel up to the height of your wire. I used a 25 gauge copper, and I've got my snips, and then I'm going to smooth it over using my nylon pliers before I sculpt it. I always find that this helps me to start with a clean slate. For the soft curves that I had in mind, I used the round nose pliers. Think about the shape of the plier nose when you are working with your wire to give you the fold in the sharp corners or soft corners that you could potentially want in your design. I like to use tweezers or pliers like this to place it on my piece, but you can see that I'm kind of slipping around with this as it is. So it's not necessarily complicated, but it's very painstaking and careful work. Once I have my wires placed, I'm going to do a thin layer of more clear on top of it, just a little bit here to hopefully solidify and build up around my wire so it will really stick and hold onto my piece during the firing. At this point, I'm going to pop it back in to fire it another minute and a half. Same process as before of check the kiln temperature, make sure I'm being safe with my hair pulled back and my sleeves pushed up, and then let it slow cool. Or I can let it slow cool and quench it after maybe like 20 seconds or so. I have my color here, and this is an opaque. You can double check the label for if it's transparent or opaque. And with this process, I'm going to be doing what's called wet packing. I have a tiny bit of water in this paint palette. I have my color here, and then I have a very small paintbrush. And what I plan to do is mix the smallest amount of water with my enamel so I can get it to a paintable paste, and then I can kind of fill in my wire areas of cloisonne to control where my color goes more than when I sift it. As I paint my enamel into these sections, I don't have to be super careful about the wire, like what I'm touching right now with my tweezers. As it fires, usually it will melt and flow down. If you want to be really careful, you can kind of wipe off your area of your exposed wire, but it should flow down, or you can sand it off later. And then the only thing that I am not going to show here is I need my enamel to dry before I fire it. And you saw that I packed it down. I want that still compacted. It's called wet packing because you need your sand to be all pressed together, because otherwise what you might find is you get a little tiny explosion, just like in the ceramics world when you have an air pocket hidden between layers. From this point on, all of the steps are covered on this handout for you. You are simply going to build up your layers of enamel until they're all level with your layer of wire. And then at the very end, I will demo again later in our project how to sand and level down your top surface of your enamel. And then we'll be able to fire it once more just to get that shine back. This is after my very first layer of wet packing. I didn't let mine dry, and if you look really close, this camera doesn't pick it up, but there's a few pinholes there where my water boiled and kind of pushed my enamel out of the way because it fired wet. The nice thing is I can layer over more layers of enamel on top of this and pack it in each time and start to fill in those gaps as I see them. And then that is the process for cloisonne.